Good morning, afternoon, evening, everybody, wherever you are from around the world. And welcome to our session on AI and wellbeing for the Empowering Learners for the Age of AI conference. It's wonderful to see you guys here today and exploring one of what we think is the most important questions of our time. But how can we use AI to not just enhance learning, but to truly support human wellbeing? We know that AI is transforming the way students learn, how teachers engage, and how universities are reimagining education. But as exciting as that is, it also invites us to pause and ask, what does it mean to thrive as a learner in this new era? How do we stay balanced, connected, and resilient while navigating technology that's evolving faster than ever before? So today's panel will unpack those questions from several angles, so from education, psychology, and also a little bit of lifestyle. We'll talk about how AI can boost engagement and motivation, but also how it intersects with mental health, identity, and belonging. And importantly, we're going to step outside the classroom too and consider how things like physical activity and sport can also help create that sense of balance and well-being. I'm delighted to be joined today by an inspiring group of panelists who bring diverse expertise and experiences to this conversation. So we have Dr. Tanya Gamby, co-founder and Chief Health and Wellness Officer for Matter and Space, Professor Srecko Joksimovic, co-director for the Centre for Change and Complexity in Learning, or C3L, at the University of South Australia, and Associate Professor Laura Allen from the University of Minnesota. And I'm Rebecca Marrone. I'm also from the Centre for Change and Complexity in Learning with Srecko at UniSA. So thank you for being here and joining us for what promises to be a rich and thought-provoking discussion. We're going to start the session by hearing from our panelists, and we're going to hear about their perspectives on wellbeing and AI and why they think it's important. We'll then go through some questions, but I note that there's already a few questions in the Hoover app, and if you post them in the chat as well, I'll monitor them and we'll get to them if we get some time at the end. But thank you all for joining us today. And I might start, actually, Tanya, you're first on my screen that I can see here. So Tanya, I might ask you to kick us off, start with a little bit about yourself and the importance of wellbeing and the work that you guys are doing.
Sure. Thanks, Beck. So I'm Tanya Gamby, and like Beck said, I'm a clinical psychologist, but I've also spent the last 2 years in this platform that we've been developing, which is this interesting intersection of this question exactly of can you bring wellness with AI into educational settings? And, it's been really exciting to see what's possible. We're creating these chatbots, we are using wellness interventions, and clearly the answer is emerging to be yes. Right? So if you're watching the literature out there, chatbots are doing a really good job. My little bot that I'm making, which is just a coaching bot, I actually would say rivals me, is better, actually, to be really honest, in terms of some of the things that it says and its adherence to the models that it's trying to match. And the early literature saying that we're seeing an improvement in mental health scores, in anxiety and depression, self-regulation. So we're seeing that these bots, I think we first kind of said, oh, these bots, there's no way they're going to replace therapy, no way they're going to replace therapists. And I have to say, they will in the short term. So I'm going to have some caveats to that. So I want to start there of that, definitely not coming in here as somebody who's a Luddite who's saying, no technology ever. And, we're coming into this space, I think we're in trouble, right? Everybody knows that we've got a mental health crisis, we've got a loneliness epidemic. You've got teen anxiety and depression at record highs. You've got single men without children spending most of their time alone. I just read a stat that they are watching 7 hours of TV for every 1 hour of in-person socializing. Our helpfulness for Americans, at least, or for other community members has dropped by 30%. And when you look at loneliness, the health effects, the long-term health effects are comparable to smoking and obesity. So it's not just a feeling, it's actually a massive health crisis that we're so, you can say in some ways we're more digitally connected than ever before, and yet we're emotionally and socially disconnected. And so I really was kind of thinking about what was I going to say, and I was thinking back to 2017. I had read Zuckerberg, his Facebook groups had emerged at that time, and he came out and wrote this manifesto called Building a Global Community. And here I'm building these bots that are like really effective, really kind of cool. And I just wanted to read what he said. I thought it was a nice framing to maybe warn us a little bit. So this was from his quote. I remember where I was. I'm sitting on the beach. I read this quote. I feel really inspired by it. So history is the story of how we've learned to come together in ever greater numbers, from tribes to cities to nations. At each step, we built social infrastructures like community, media, and governments to empower us to achieve things we couldn't on our own. Today, we are close to taking our next step. Our greatest opportunities are now global, like spreading prosperity and freedom, promoting peace and understanding, lifting people out of poverty, and accelerating science. Our greatest challenges also need global responses, like ending terrorism, fighting climate change, and preventing pandemics. Progress now requires humanity coming together, not just as cities and nations, but also as a global community. This is especially important right now, and Facebook stands for bringing us closer together and building a global community. So fast forward to 2025, and I would actually, we know these social media devices have been a massive determinant of some of the social disintegration that we're seeing, some of the loneliness. You have half of Gen Z saying that they wish that Instagram and TikTok didn't exist. You have kids who are saying that they're growing up performing instead of developing or forming. I had a client who was saying to me, I always have to be Insta ready. And I was like, what's Insta ready? And she's like, in case I need to like take an Insta selfie in the bathroom. And I was like, oh my goodness. She's like, my bathroom has to be cute. I have to be cute. And I was like, oh, that's big. And so just to bookend the Zuckerberg thing, and I was told I have 5 to 10 minutes. I'm going to rant at you for a little bit. So I just read an article that came out from Jonathan Haidt, who's been doing The Anxious Generation, sent out a newsletter, and Freya India had this beautiful quote that she said, for our generation, we need to acknowledge what we've lost, to grieve a time we never knew. We are the first to try and handle adolescence while performing and marketing ourselves at the same time. The first to never know friendship before it became keeping up with snap streaks, before community before it became Instagram and Reddit forums, or finding love before it became swiping and subscription models. The next generation has a chance, but for us, there's no getting back our adolescence. This is where we are. And that seemed like such a powerful bookend from this optimism and this kind of techno optimism that I think we started thinking that we were in these connected spaces, and that I'm feeling as I'm looking at my bots that are able to do kind of amazing things. We're going to do some research out at UMN. We have some other research going on. And what we're seeing, which I think is interesting, is, and I think AI is going to accelerate this. I'm pretty sure we're becoming hermits by design. We have created worlds where we can isolate ourselves entirely. We can get all of our food delivered. We can work from home. We can do school from home. We can now do therapy, not only from home, but with a bot. You don't even have to have a human in the room with you. So what we've done is we're really beginning to isolate. Kids aren't outside playing anymore. And it's convenient. It feels good. And what was um, but we're tribal and we're supposed to be together, right? We really don't do well when we're by ourselves. And I'm writing this last night, and this is a real thing. I'm writing this, I'm thinking about what I'm going to say, and I'm simultaneously getting texts from close girlfriends asking me if I want to do something tonight. And I am thinking of excuses for why I should not go because I'm in my pajamas and I have this thing, and I'm like, oh my goodness, you're writing about how we're becoming hermits, and you are simultaneously turning down girlfriends asking you to do things. But I think we're really trading short-term convenience for long-term flourishing. What feels good in the moment actually isn't what's good for us long-term. And I think Srecko is going to touch on this with exercise as one of those. We all know exercise is good for us, but if it's hard to do. And I'm excited for him to talk about that. So I would say these aren't individual problems. They're kind of emergent problems of how we're designing modern life. It's convenience. We're kind of in the fast food nation, I think, of life, of socializing, of what's easy versus what's good for us. Um, so I think one of the things we need to be looking at is there's the immediate impact of AI therapy bots, AI wellness interventions, but I actually think that we need to be expanding some of the research on that. We really don't know the long-term implications. Do they increase isolation? There's some early indicators that up to a certain point, spending time with a therapy chatbot is good. And beyond that point, you see diminishing returns and even harm because then they're beginning to isolate. So things like social network analysis, civic and group engagement, like really looking at the network effects in a way that we didn't with social media till more recently. So, I think as we zoom out and we think about well-being as not the absence of distress, so I'd move beyond just saying depression and anxiety, which is what we kind of look at sometimes, but really how are we cultivating a life of flourishing with vitality, purpose, and coherence, connected to ourselves, connected to our communities, connected to our natural world, and can AI augment that? So I don't think I'm thinking about can AI replace, it's where are the opportunities that we actually augment what we've lost, that we can kind of take back some of this time that AI affords us to do the things we're actually not doing well right now. I think we're going to have to be thinking about this ahead of time. And one of the things I think is interesting is we co-regulate together. So when you're in a space with somebody, your brain sync, your heart rate sync, breathing syncs up. So we don't do that as much over screens. And you can feel it. When you're in presence with people, you actually feel their bodies, you smell them, for better or for worse. And when we're over a screen, we've lost some of that. And then you add AI and it's another layer of disconnection. And we actually don't know the long-term impacts of when we're not co-regulating physiologically like that. That's a new phenomenon. So I don't think that we have an answer on that. So, if we look at these hack your life and how to optimize yourself, they're all solo. They're morning routines that are by yourself. And so if we optimize time with what AI can do for us, I read something that Bill Gates had said where he was like, we don't have enough caretakers. We don't have enough teachers. We don't have enough. So maybe the ways we're optimizing well-being actually isn't through the chatbots. It's through enhancing the community infrastructures around the chatbots, putting more time into some of that. So I think I would end that by saying that universities and schools are the largest training centers in the world, and they really can change human behavior at scale by deciding what we teach, how much time every day that people spend in certain activities, how much time they spend in human-to-human interaction. And I think it's kind of an obligation for these new systems to be looking at that. We're not going to replace AI, but we may be able to actually maximize the community and other well-being parts that actually come from the humans. So I don't think that's what necessarily people expected me to say, but I think that would be the place I would think we have the most impact right now.
Thanks, Tanya. I think you've raised some really interesting points there, particularly around the augmenting. I think we'll circle back to that in a little bit because I think there's some very interesting angles that we could go down. But Laura, maybe if you could please just, introduce yourself a little bit and tell us your stance on this topic as well.
Yeah, hey, I'm Laura Allen. I'm associate professor at University of Minnesota, and my background's in cognitive science and really thinking about how people sort of take in information and represent information and make meaning in the world. When people talk about well-being lately, I think it like it strikes me that it's often like in the language of optimization. And I think, like being more productive or getting like higher happiness scores and you're getting on the leaderboard for happiness or whatever. And I don't think I think at a fundamental level, like I wanted to start there and think about the fact that maybe that's not necessarily how we should be framing wellness and we should be thinking about it more from a balanced perspective. And so one of the things I've been thinking about a lot is that we're sort of constantly in our like modern society having to balance between our mind, our body, our relationships and society. And all of those things are constantly changing and we're sort of having to adapt in different sorts of ways. And so what matters for wellness to me is sort of like what's happening inside and feeling like you have choices and can make decisions that sort of help you, prioritize and keep that balance. And so when I was thinking about this talk and sort of how AI intersects with that sort of conceptualization of well-being, I was thinking about sort of how it's not really like, is AI going to make us happier or is AI going to make me depressed, but also sort of like to Tanya's point earlier, it's like how is AI changing the sort of conditions that allow us to have well-being in the first place, right? And sort of I was thinking about well-being at sort of three different levels or this sort of intersection at three levels. So at the individual level, sort of how AI intersects with our thoughts and our habits that sort of change the way that we're thinking and intersecting with the world. At relational levels, how it shapes our connections with other people. And then at sort of societal level and how it impacts the environments that sort of define our more collective well-being as a society. So when I think about the individual level, right, there's like obvious places that AI can sort of be useful, right? So we know that it can sort of like help lighten our cognitive load or our emotional load. It can sort of allow us to offload things that we need to remember, like I never know anyone's phone number anymore. I don't have to remember where I need to go, right? Like I don't get lost as much as I used to. I don't know. And so they can, and we can also do things like I don't have a little tracker, but I know a lot of people love like their little, sleep trackers or fitness trackers that can sort of help you spot patterns in your behaviors, right? You can do mindfulness apps. They can sort of help you think about when you're in sync and when you're not, right? And so there's all these things that when they're designed really thoughtfully can help us stay sort of aware of ourselves and support this sort of like calm focus or sense of control in the world that's sort of like constantly fragmenting our attention. But I think the same tools can also sort of like harm our self-awareness if they do too much. And I think this is kind of what Tanya was getting at earlier a little bit, sort of like when AI starts to finish our sentences or predict our next move or filter what we see or sort of like take away all those sort of like little moments of reflection that keep us like grounded in the world, sort of like that make us question like how we're feeling or how we're choosing or why we're making decisions that we're making. And I think those sort of like moments of friction are really important to like being human and being like healthy humans, like mentally healthy. And so I think at that level, at the individual level, the deeper sort of like design challenge is finding how AI can like ease the sort of cognitive load stuff, the stuff that's taking up a lot of room that we don't need to spend a lot of time on, without sort of getting rid of those moments of friction that sort of help keep us aware of ourselves. And then at the relational level, AI really obviously changes how we connect, and Tanya really talked like beautifully about that. And like on the positive side, there's so many good things that it can do to like sort of help strengthen connections with people, which I think is so important for our well-being, right? And help us sort of maintain relationships that would have been harder to sustain without these tools, right? So we have obviously things like the internet, we already know that exists, but we also have things like translation tools, right? The new sort of AirPods that allow you to, hear like translated languages, and those sorts of things can help, or writing assistants can help people express emotions that they might not have otherwise been able to express, right? So all of these things can sort of help us be more empathetic and help communication be more accessible, and sort of reduce the impact of a lot of variables that can harm relationships. But I think it's also important to think about the fact that these types of connections are not just about ease, but also about sort of the depth of the connections that we have. And similar to the sort of individual level, at the relational level, if we just sort of automate everything and make everything easy, then it can do more harm than good, right? And so relationships really need a lot of those same moments of repair that I talked about at the individual level, right? You need times where you have friction, where you don't trust, or where you might disagree on something, right? Or you might sort of like have difficulties understanding each other, and pushing through that, I think, is like what strengthens and make connections really powerful. But AI can oftentimes sort of try to sort of optimize that too, by sort of like making everybody agree with everyone, or only showing you content that you agree with, right? And sort of making you feel like you're right all the time. And so we need to really think about design in this way, by AI that's actually allows for you to be emotionally present and not just sort of like, having easy relationships. And then at the societal level, obviously AI is shaping all of the environments that, all the information that we sort of see and the things that we share, and the sort of landscape where we sort of make sense of the world as a collective group. And in many ways, that's a really great thing, right? It can bring up overlooked voices. So it can also help, people who often don't feel heard, be heard, right? And sort of surface all these different perspectives and help communities coordinate problems. So when there's like, you know, pandemics, right? It can help, or there's different sorts of epidemics that have happened, and it can sort of help build community in that way. But that same personalization that makes information feel really relevant can also sort of pull us apart and put us into filter bubbles and things like that, right? So when algorithms decide what we see and sort of like dictates things based on engagement, then they're sort of shifting the boundaries of our sort of collective world. And that narrowing changes more than, it's not just what we know, but it's sort of who we trust, who we see as part of, our same group. And so to me, thinking about that sort of collective well-being is also really important when we're thinking about well-being. It's not just like how I feel, and how, like if I feel healthy today, but also sort of like the health of our society. And that involves like the relationships amongst people. So I think like at the end, when I think about the role of AI and well-being, I think a lot about sort of designing for this balance and knowing that AI and these systems are always going to be changing, but what it means is like making sure that we design in ways that are not just sort of making things easier for everybody, but really creating sort of helping us to see patterns, but in a more like sort of transparent way. So we sort of, can still have moments of friction and moments for growth. So.
Thanks, Laura. I think some very interesting points there. I really like the discussion around tension and that friction. I think that's super key and super important, and something I'm personally grappling with is how am I using these tools or thinking about working with these tools. There's some great questions coming in the chat, and I think one from Juliana actually kind of relates a little bit to that, where it says, what I'm mostly concerned about AI and wellbeing relates to the responsibility behind the algorithms. If things are flagged on the systems, who is responsible? So it's another layer on that kind of social dimension, and maybe we'll come back to these questions. But people, please keep posting them. They're very interesting, and we'll make our way through them. But before we do that, Srecko, just over to you for a minute, please.
It's hard to follow after Tanya and Laura, especially given that I learned a lot from both of you over the last few years. That kind of, I'll probably repeat most of what you said already. But for me, both Tanya and Laura touched on all those apps that you see nowadays, and moving towards individual well-being, which shouldn't be individual because we are not alone out there, and we depend on others as well. And especially on Tanya's point on loneliness, and we saw in the recent more anecdotal than actually proper research of the use of AI in a classroom in South Australia, that children actually asked ChatGPT to become their friend, which is not where we want to go with all this technology. But there was Tanya made a good point at the beginning. Do we want AI to become a therapist? So there are different levels that most of those apps promote AI when it comes to the mental health. Most of the time it's companion, it's a coach, it's a therapist, right? So on the scale from 1 to 10, how much I would like AI to become my therapist, I would say 0. And we all know why, right? So I was reading the paper the other day. I think it's called, I have it ready. So if you want to take a look, it's a really interesting paper, ChatGPT and the Frustrated Socrates, right? So this is two physics teachers actually asked a simple physics question from ChatGPT, and ChatGPT was constantly giving wrong answers. And what they did, they tried to use ChatGPT as a student, and teacher would exercise as in, hey, I want to teach you about those basic concepts from physics. One of the most important things that they noticed is that ChatGPT will never say, oh yeah, my bad, I made a mistake, and accept the feedback. Instead of that, ChatGPT always came as the arrogant, knowing-all entity that basically never accepts the feedback from the human in a way that you would expect from your students. So, and they're experts, they know this. If I'm not an expert in physics and I ask the same question, I'm like, yep, this makes perfect sense, because AI does make it to sound really good and to sound logical, right? On the other hand, the other day we were writing, of course, it was a Learning Analytics Conference deadline. I think it was last week. It was long ago, right? And you play with ideas, you try to brainstorm a few things, and I did. I asked ChatGPT, hey, which point should I raise in this lit review section? And it gave me perfectly well-written 4 paragraphs around something, and I deleted all of them because none of them made sense, and none of them was communicated the idea that I wanted actually to put in my paper. But this is, again, because I know what I'm looking for. So if you give AI as a therapist to someone who doesn't know what they are looking for, doesn't know what's right from wrong, then you can imagine where that's going to go. So that's why I think AI as a companion, as something that gives us hints about how someone might feel or what kind of support someone might need, is more important than a therapist. And I think that's where we should be forcing things to go. So for me, the whole idea of bringing AI into the mix is about rethinking where well-being happens. So most of the time, we focus on the prevention, whether it being in school or clinics. I don't know, Tanya, I might be wrong, but I wouldn't think that people go to the professional therapist as a prevention, right? So it's usually treating something that happened and dealing with something that we could have prevented before. So with AI and pushing this notion of well-being as a community problem, as a problem for all of us, is something that we can actually utilize AI more efficiently. That's why Tanya mentioned we are talking about moving outside of the classroom and into the community sport and engaging with, because most of the days children go to school, teachers are busy teaching. Nobody actually pays as much attention as we might want to preventing some of those issues. But then after school, they go do the sports. They go, I don't know, to arts lessons or whatever they might be doing after school. We are missing that bit. And that's why we basically might be able to pick up more of those hints, what might be wrong down the road, and engage in preventing those potentially hurtful behaviors down the road. And the other thing is well-being as a human interdependence. Both Laura and Tanya touched on that. We are not alone here, right? So to me, it's not just about, and I think Laura said that nicely, it's not about myself being more happy or less distressed and so on, but how do we rethink the well-being as the human interdependence, and how do we use AI to support this relationship building rather than making me smile more often today? I don't smile much. So yeah.
We might want to work on the smiling Srecko.
Oh yeah, I should.
Thank you. Awesome, guys. Thank you for the introductions. Really key and interesting things that I think we could probably spend hours talking about. Considering you guys are at the forefront of a lot of different, things from your respective backgrounds, I want to know, what are some emerging trends that you are seeing in this space? I'll throw it open to anyone if anybody wants to comment on that.
I'm happy to dive back into and it kind of relates to some of the questions in the chat. I mean, so we're definitely seeing them used as companions and as therapists. And as Srecko said, I think there's a difference between the global ChatGPT as a therapist that's not necessarily been optimized, that's more optimized for attention, versus agents that are specifically AI that's being optimized for therapy or as a wellness chat. And we are definitely seeing efficacy in those tutors, learning tutors. So we're seeing these spaces, I think, that they can augment. And I noticed in the chat, ways to wrap around students with neurodivergent profiles or anxiety. And absolutely, I think that's some of what our platform, this Matter in Space platform we've been working on, is doing. So as much as I talked about, let's make sure we're doing the other parts, the AI is actually doing, if you say to ChatGPT right now, if you say, I've got a student with this profile, so change the learning to match this learning profile. So I do IEPs and part of my clinical work, or I don't know, for people in other countries, these are individualized education plans in the United States where you're basically wrapping around some sort of learning difference for a student. And the AI can modify for dyslexia, for dysgraphia, for things that I'm putting in, and do a pretty good job. Now, there's some problems with the context window, and it can remember to keep doing it, and it doesn't keep the profile in front and center, no. But you can really see those trends where it's going to be able to wrap around some of these individual differences and augment learning differences and socio-emotional differences in a way that we haven't been able to do before, and coach and remind, and it's going to have other deficits, but in those areas it's really showing some promise, I think, in being pretty interesting and pretty effective.
Thanks, Tanya. Anybody else? Laura, Srecko?
I can jump in quickly to the slightly different trend, and I think relates to just trying to find the question. Juliana's question around who's responsible, who will be watching and caring. So just one of the, well, no, it's not a trend as much as it's part of more recent policy documents. If we look into the European Union AI Act and other policy documents out there, so we can't just deploy the system and forget about it. So a huge part, and I really think that trend should be strictly enforced, we are responsible to monitoring what's happening and what kind of interactions we are getting with all those systems that we deploy. So yes, most of the trends are still on that supporting individual level well-being, but we do have responsibility to track what is actually going on in our system. I don't see this as a point of there's a lot of discussion around, are we constantly monitoring someone? Well, not about monitoring someone and keeping an eye on someone all the time, but more allowing them that self-reflection and space for them to grow basically and reflect. But again, in that sense, we need to, all of us will be responsible pretty much for everyone's well-being. But if we are deploying, like Tanya knows this, and George from the experience recently with the Metro and Space, you can't just deploy an agent out there and say, hey, we're going to help you with your well-being, and just ignore what's happening there. So one of the trends, basically, I think it's more focus on that responsibility from pretty much all of us involved in that process of deploying well-being agents out there to keep monitoring and improving the kind of interaction that we are designing for.
Just to sort of add to that too, I think one of the things that came up a lot in sort of like, or is coming up a lot in different sort of spaces, is sort of like the idea that there are a lot of things that we sort of use AI for, or like optimize for, or teach or something, right, that have very obvious outcome measures that can be measurable, and sort of we as a society or group of people have determined is like the appropriate outcome, right? So like if you have a math problem, it's like, this is the right one and this is the wrong answer, and sort of we all kind of agree on that. But I think when it comes to well-being, I think what's going to be interesting, and what we're already starting to see sort of shape out, is like there's no sort of one way that people look, and feel like they've achieved well-being, right? And I think for a long time, I think a lot of apps were getting that wrong, and sort of like trying to come up with these like hard line rules for like what it means to be healthy. And that doesn't have to mean physically, but it can be like mentally healthy or whatever, right? But sort of like this is how many hours you should spend with other people, or this is how many books you should read, or this is how many like steps in a day. Like everyone got really hung up on the 10,000 steps, right? And like all these different very specific sorts of things, versus really thinking about like how to target for different types of people in different cultures and different contexts and that sort of stuff. And I think figuring out, how to do that appropriately, I think that's where AI could be really useful, but I don't think that's necessarily where a lot of people initially went, right? They were sort of coming up with these like weird benchmarks. But I think AI could be a really useful place to sort of individualize at that sort of level.
I think that's a really key point, actually, Laura. And obviously, we didn't start this panel with a definition of well-being either. So, everybody spoke about it from different perspectives. We're talking about it from individual, societal, environmental, and so forth. And we have obviously differences across all of those aspects and beyond. And I think that's quite important. And I agree. I think that's a key failure of some of those early well-being or mental health models that we saw, is where we are trying to optimize, or we're trying to, like you said earlier, actually, Laura, can I increase my happiness score, or can we gamify this? What does that look like, and can bring a lot of things into question. And I think we are seeing a bit of a shift more towards now that individual and personalized well-being, and what that means for you, and how these tools can work to support you. Which leads kind of into my next question around metrics or frameworks. What are we seeing, or what do you think you would like to see in terms of frameworks or guidelines or whatever it may be, to meaningfully evaluate whether AI is genuinely enhancing well-being rather than simply optimizing? And I guess that's from, an individual perspective more than anything. But what are you guys kind of hoping for, or what are you in the process of creating yourselves as well in this space?
Okay, maybe I can start. Seems like we're all shy today. There is I don't think we have the right framework, to be honest. I think we need a new one. So we should publish a paper on that. But I do think, and it seems to me that from what Tanya and Laura and I and of course you back have been talking about today, I know most of the current applications is focused on the individual well-being. But then there was recently I was part of the commercialization project here in South Australia. One of the groups, they were focusing on supporting all the community members in developing meaningful relationships. And one of the main blockers in that people stated as hey, this is very difficult for me in developing meaningful relationships is I don't have time. Well, kind of relationships are hard and it takes time to develop meaningful relationships, right? So you can't say I want meaningful relationship and then say I don't have time for this. So I do think that the framework and those key metrics around well-being should be derived from something that does reflect that human interdependence and not just independence, because we are dependent on other humans. And I think that instead of how many steps I made today should focus more on empathic connection, right? So on that empathy side of the well-being, or reciprocity, or how much good I did for someone else versus how much they did for me, or something around community coherence and related topics. So to me, I don't think that we do have. There is actually. I know that there are quite a lot of discussion around the framework of ethics of care, but I think the ideas around these frameworks of ethics of care were mostly right. It's just that some of the translation practice didn't really work out well. So, but I do think that notion of ethics of care and developing something that would show us more of that interdependence is still needed, and I don't think we have the right framework, to be honest, just yet.
I want to follow up on something there, Srecko, because also, given that I know your work and some of the stuff that you do in the teamwork space with Andrew, so one of our colleagues here at UniSA as well, Dr. Andrew Zimichnik, and in particular around coaching and teamwork, and coming back to that as well, can you speak to some of the stuff that you've been doing in that space, or even with the soccer club as well, and how we can kind of create that community and that buy-in from people in the community across different areas?
Yeah, so that's there are a few reasons why we want to shift into that domain of health and sports and education. First of all, we think that's still unexplored area, and second of all, nobody funds education in Australia. So we're trying to make that meaningful link between, because taking care of our health and well-being, again, as I mentioned, doesn't really happen only within classroom or only when we go to a specialized clinic. Not everyone can afford those, or not everyone actually gets the right attention at school. So the whole logic here is basically, how do we engage the community in getting some, not in the sense of treatment, but prevention. So we are focusing in this proposal that we're currently writing, and pretty much everyone, Beck and Tanya and Laura, pretty much involved with that one. We are trying to shift that well-being to the community and try to understand what kind of indicators can we extract from how adolescents engage in sports, for instance, because it could be that some of the children come to training all the time, but they still feel lonely. That's something that we never unpack, simply because most of the, for instance, community coaching is done by parents or coaches who are not necessarily experts in mental health and well-being. So they also need that kind of support in preventing some of the issues that might happen down the road. And another thing is, we have been raised in totally different environment. And if you just look some of the professional players today, like Robert Lewandowski from Barcelona, right? He said, my coach used to yell at me all the time. Those coaches are still there. Those coaches who yell at children all the time. But what Robert also said is that generations today need people who talk to them all the time. So we need, our children don't react to yelling the same way we used to. So they need more that emotional approach, and more that constant talk, constant reminder why they're doing what they're doing, that they are good, that they are trying, need to keep trying. And that's where we see the opportunity to link basically the exercise, sport, and health and well-being in a hopefully one exciting project.
Thanks, Laura. Tanya, I'll come back to you for the question around models or frameworks if you have anything to add at all. Otherwise, we can jump into some of the interesting ones in the chat as well.
I was going to just quickly, there was just a few. I mean, I think there are some models out there in frameworks. There's a PERMA model from Seligman that really looks at, positive engagement or positive emotion, engagement, relationships, meanings, and accomplishment, really kind of looking more at this multi-dimensional idea of well-being. Because I agree, we haven't well-defined, we didn't even start this. Everybody has their own definition. There's a comment on that. There's a flourishing index. There's some indexes on psychological flexibility. I think we could look at things like civic engagement, just because there's such a high correlation with well-being and actual connection and civic engagement, community trends. But I also think, touching back on what Srecko was saying, is I think we actually really need to be looking at people holistically. Like, well-being is not just in your head, it's in your body, it's in your community. So it's in this holistic you, in a way that I think we need to be measuring at a more whole level, rather than piecing out the pieces of it, because they actually are interdependent.
Yeah, for sure. Laura, anything that you wanted to add to that one?
Not really, except for I just wanted to highlight Dr. Keller's comment in the chat about this, about sort of like how can we design these tools that, I'll just read it, that invite students, users, people to co-create their own definitions of balance and success rather than imposing a prescriptive model of wellness. And I think that's such an important question related to this point, because I think so many of our, like, of the measures that do exist do sort of assume, like, I think they do a better job than some, but they still sort of assume there's like a way to feel, and they are created a lot at the aggregate level. So thinking about sort of like, what generally do I think people mean when they are happy or are whatever, right? And they don't really account for the sort of very different ways that people come to feel good or fulfilled, and the like wild individual differences that we know exist in people, and in terms of how they cope and how they sort of respond to the world. And I think that, like, I think there's a much more sort of radical take on this, where you really think about AI is sort of like helping you achieve whatever equilibrium or whatever that you want, and there's no like us telling you what that should be, but I think there's got to be a lot of thinking around what that is, because I don't know if people know how to. I think that's a whole skill, right? Is like determining what that looks like for yourself, and how that can be scaffolded feels really important.
I think there's another question here from Dr. Keller that touches on that as well, to one of your earlier points, Tanya, about Insta-ready comments. So the question is, sometimes tools meant to support well-being can actually increase pressure. For example, students might be encouraged to log their moods, track sleep, count steps. We've touched on that. But how do we make sure AI isn't turning self-care into another form of self-surveillance? And I think that's quite interesting language. And actually, I come back to what you were saying, Laura, around the tensions. And where do we feel comfortable with the tensions, and where do we not? And at what point are we willing to offload or unload some of these things onto a therapist versus, an AI bot, versus maybe I don't need a therapist. I just want to increase, one little part of my life to have overall better well-being, because that's a goal that I have. So what are people's comments on that? Tanya, start with you.
Yeah, I think those are going to be the questions of our time, is, of what goes from, and we gave all this data, and the surveillance capitalism questions that came up from that, and what feels like pressure versus what felt like authentic sharing, or, people, to Laura's point, and I love the other point in there of having people co-create what makes them happy, what makes them not happy. people are really bad at predicting what makes them happy, which I think is really interesting. So actually, if you ask people, we do this scale in therapy a lot of times where we ask people to rate kind of how much pleasure versus productivity. And it's really interesting. It's a lot of simple things that make people happy. It'll be just hanging out with a friend. It won't be the big achievements that they expect it to be. Lots of research on that. So there's this weird tension of we're not educating people to know what's going to make them happy. So they're guessing wrong. So they're striving for things that are wrong, and then they're not tracking it. So they actually don't even know. They keep striving after the same thing, thinking that's kind of going in the right direction. And you slow them down and say, like, just rate your day. It's really interesting to have them kind of say, oh, actually, it was like the hot shower I took was the happiest part of my day. The great music I listened to in the morning. So I don't know that I have a good answer. I think those are the questions we should be asking. And I think that we will be, as a whole, co-discovering, but they're great questions.
Yeah, no, I'll bring it back to actually another comment that I think relates quite well to that point from Steve. So saying in terms of isolation and loneliness, we need to understand what levels of connection are sufficient. So if you're engaging in a phone call, in an online small group or personal interaction with someone you have met before, with someone you meet occasionally or not at all. We need to understand ourselves, and then we can understand how AI can augment well-being and connection. I think it's fascinating, but it implies a level of self-reflection and the ability to know what you need. A lot of the time we work with people that don't know that, or it's, if we're working with K to 12 as well, what can we be doing to kind of address some of that? How are we developing this understanding? Or how can we use these AI tools for people to help develop their own understanding, their own self-reflection, so that they can best use them? Does anybody have any thoughts or comments on that?
Well, again, I guess, I mean, these are great questions. I don't think we have easy answers, right? If we had, oh, but you're right. I mean, the thing is, we can't say, hey, you need 5 friends. Maybe 1 friend is more than enough, right? If I have meaningful connection with that 1 friend. But then again, the frameworks that Tanya mentioned, obviously, I'm not expert in those frameworks, but obviously there is a lot of work done in the space. Some of those metrics that come from the existing frameworks that could tell us a bit more about where they sit with respect to my own holistic well-being versus where they stand to where I want to be, could be good driver. I mean, it could be that I don't see that I need more friends, but then again, AI coming with some of the as a companion and talking to me about some of the important points I'm missing with not having more friends could be a way to guide in the direction. So I don't think I have a good answer, but the thing is, some relationship between self-reflection and what would be some good practices is the way to go. And at the end of the day, it's about a learner human agency. We decide where we want to be. It's not up to AI to tell us, hey, you need to have 5 friends. If I don't need that many friends, I'm never going to have that many friends. But again, it's the space of negotiation. What's the best practice? What most of the people in my community do, and where do I sit? It just in a way, again, going back to self-reflection, what do I want to get out of this?
I think too, like, I think the self-reflection is really important, but I think we need to like help scaffold like self-reflection that isn't just focused on like short-term goals. And I think that's part of it too, is like, I think we've been touching on this, but there's all these different scales that you can think about things. And so I might like right now want to have an easy conversation, or like, I might think the thing that's going to make me happy is for this conversation to go easily. Right. But maybe that's not the thing that's going to help in the long term. Right. And so when we're thinking about like designing AI systems or designing for different sorts of contexts, I think we have to sort of like constantly be balancing that. And I think it's going to be a really complex sort of issue where if we design, I mean, I think this is where like social media has gone wrong, right? Is like designing for immediate engagement right now, right? And not really thinking about sort of how that plays out and at longer time scales and at different sorts of places. But I think like thinking about if I do this, what will happen immediately, but what will the consequences be for me, and sort of how do those impact me, or sort of like get internalized in me, in my worldview.
I'd also add a little bit about kind of what we know about isolation and loneliness to Steve's question is, we kind of have a lot of data right now about a lot of shallow connections, which is where a lot of people sit right now, is they have many, many shallow connections. And it used to be office mates might be shallow connections too, or intermediate, but social media tends to be a ton of mini connections, that you're chatting. In general, the connection and the loneliness research is on even one person. Srecko was saying even one person that you can depend on. Like if you look at males' happiness levels and male depression levels in particular, when they get married, they go up. There used to be research actually that when women get married, their depression, their happiness goes down, which was a different reason, where women holding two burdens. And anyways, I'll put that aside. But many times, a lot of that research is on deeper connections and having someone you can depend on. Who do you, if you're in trouble, who do you call? And so I think we know some about what we're considering sufficient. But I think, Steve, your question raised for me, there's been a lot of conversations around, are we teaching people the skills of deeper connection at all? And so some of these kids are growing up without what Laura was speaking of, that tension where you're developing, you're repairing, where you're practicing being in a huge fight, telling somebody something deep, having them match you. And I think particularly for men, we're seeing a really big gap in skills of really deep connection with other people. And so you're really seeing those numbers, suicide rates. If you look at some of the transcripts of men who've committed suicide in particular, a lot of them is, I'm useless to everybody, I'm worthless, I don't have any value, and lots of kind of isolation points that are being raised, I think. So I think your question, Steve, is so important. What is sufficient? And then are we teaching the language to have that sufficient relationship? And that's a certain way I think AI actually can help. It's easier to tell an AI bot and practice some of that stuff with the bot than with a human being. So that's an area that I think is kind of interesting for practicing, but not sufficient to learn the language, and then you need humans.
Yeah. So there are tons of amazing questions and comments in the chat. And I'm just mindful of time. We've only got a few minutes left. I did just want to end with a question for everyone. So looking ahead, what is the most promising frontier in AI for wellbeing that excites you? And then conversely, what emerging risks keep you up at night? So Laura, we might start with you on this one, if that's okay. Oh, you're just muted there. There we go.
Why? Sorry. Yeah, I think in terms of excitement, well, I'll start with the thing that keeps me up at night, because I feel like it's easier to say it backwards. But I think the thing that keeps me up at night is that we lose the ability to sort of thoughtfully engage with other people and with complex ideas, and that things are so sort of like automated for us and sort of personalized to us that we don't question things. We just sort of like keep going, and we sort of become like automatic just receptors of whatever comes at us, right? And responders. Um, and I think like, as things become more and more personalized, that we're sort of like, we just lose agency. And I think that word agency has like come up a lot in this. And I think that's the thing that keeps me up at night. And so I think to that like opposite side of the coin, I think where I feel excited is really thinking about AI that's designed to be more like, I don't know if this is the right way to say it, but sort of like humble, in the sense that we think about AI, and maybe it's not even that it's humble, that's a weird way to say it, but AI, that we sort of recognize its limits, and sort of like not, it's designed to sort of be used as a tool, but it sort of scaffolds deeper thinking instead of in questioning, instead of sort of designing for engagement. So I think thinking about how it can sort of, foster and point out gaps in our understanding, or help sort of like push us to think more deeply about things, or show us where we might be biased, and sort of like surfacing like other side perspectives or different sorts of things like that, I think is where I feel excited about it. Yeah.
Tanya?
Vicky, do I even think I have a good answer for this? And I think in a certain way where I get hopeful, we're modeling and we're doing much more complex abilities to, I think, individualize and wrap around people with some of these tools. I do think the therapy implications are profound because it can be homework in between sessions. It can be, an augmenter. It can do some of the services. So I think there's some really interesting, but the place that I was thinking about the other day, which might be extraordinarily Pollyanna-ish, is if you think about social media echoing back our worst selves, what if AI is echoing back our best selves? What if it could be a mirror for our better selves and helping us develop parts of ourselves that are gentler and kinder and more authentic? I don't know, but I feel like we are shaping this technology and we amplify and put out what we receive. And my ChatGPT is lovely to me. And there's some risk, huge risk of it being too lovely and I can't interface with other people. But there's a balance in there, I think, where we maybe are on the other side of what ChatGPT did, which is help us, what social media did, where we just rage at each other and it amplifies, anger and polarization. But I think the risk is we don't know, and we're careening down this path that we really don't know, and we're taking enormous risk and isolating people for further consolidating power. I could go on and on, but it's how fast it's moving, I think, is my fear without us understanding it.
And Srecko?
No, well, I mean, great points. I would just like to maybe reflect on something that Elizabeth said in the chat, and then Juliana as well. I don't think that we are outsourcing anything. Maybe we are, but we shouldn't. I don't think that technology actually made all this mess. It was us. We are blaming technology for something we did. I used to play outside, and my parents had no idea where I was until I come back, until I get hungry and come back in the evening for dinner. I can't do that with my kids. I need to take my kids places so they can play, which is really, really annoying. It takes a lot of time, although I love my kids. But we changed the society. So what we are doing now, I don't think we are outsourcing, and we should never rely on AI to become our therapist. What I think is we should be doing, and what might be happening, is that we are asking AI for help to tell us where things might be wrong so we can jump in and deal with that before it's too late. So not outsourcing, but helping us. That would be my thinking.
I think Juliana, Dr. Keller has posted about and tagged Juliana in it. So saying every new technology is supposed to make life easier, give us more free time, etc. And yet does that happen? Maybe in some ways, but a cost benefit analysis is needed for sure. And I think that's a nice, actually, a place to end this panel is it's a cost benefit for all of us, right? And when we're thinking about well-being and where we started with the different perspectives and then the different interpretations of what well-being is, I really think it's up to us as individuals, as builders of these tools, as part of broader communities, to continue shaping the conversations and making sure that we are satisfied where AI is being used to support well-being, and where we're not, we're having really deep, rigorous conversations, well-rounded research with the right voices and lots of different voices in the room, to making sure that we are happy with the end result. So I just wanted to say thank you for everybody for joining us today. Thank you for Tanya, Laura and Srecko for your time and your fantastic comments. I know we couldn't get through all the questions in the chat, but please, if you have anything that you'd like to follow up with us, we all have our profiles on Hoover, so please reach out and send us an email. We'd love to connect and continue the conversation. But thanks a lot, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your days, evenings, whatever it may be, and enjoy the rest of the conference. So thank you very much.